Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of 5 of the Spring 2022 Royce final presentations. Today, like the other days, we have 4 students who are presenting their research projects. We've had very generative conversations thus far, and I assume today is going to be no different. For those who don't know, the Royce Fellowship was established in 1986 through the generosity of Charles Royce, class of 61, and it enables undergraduate students to conduct community-engaged research, independent projects of their own design across the United States and around the United States and across the world, or across the United States and around the world. And today we have 4 students who are presenting on what they did over the summer. We are currently accepting applications for the next cohort, the 2022-2023 cohort of students. So if you are a student who is interested in the Royce Fellowship, please feel free to reach out to me or Maggie Goddard, who's our graduate assistant. And if you are a faculty who might know a student, please send them our way as well. The deadline for that application is March 4th. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for attending. We are going to start with Kaitlan, who is going to be presenting Storytelling as Reclamation, Reshaping Post-War Memory with Young Vietnamese Americans. Take it away, Kaitlan.
Thank you, Jesus. Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlan, and I remember things. I remember things that didn't really happen. I have these scenes in my head that I've thought up to fill a space. For example, when I was little, I apparently dropped my sunglasses into the ocean from the edge of a boat. And I looked down and I said the fish were eating it up. And my dad told me this story years later over and over, which is the only reason why I can see everything now in my memory, from the color of my sunglasses, which I remember as pink, but really I have no idea what color they were, to the shape of the fish swarming around them when I dropped them. So I've been fascinated by this question for a while. What does it mean to remember? Or to add a layer of complication, what does it mean to remember things you have never experienced? If you grew up around your parents or your grandparents, or really anyone who would tell you pieces of their life, any stories at all, you'll have encountered these questions. What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to remember things you never experienced? I grew up hearing stories not just about myself and my sunglasses, but about my family. My paternal grandparents arrived in America after the fall of Saigon, as well as my maternal grandparents who arrived in 1979. I can't tell you when or what exactly my parents or grandparents told me about themselves growing up. But what I can tell you is what I remember. In my brain are stored scenes of a soldier cutting open a cow in the distance, of a cramped deck and dirty bodies, a pinch of salt in the palm of my mom's hand, my dad standing at the stern of a boat, watching paper money fly into the air. I never really shared these memories with anyone until one day when I asked my cousins what they remembered. And in my conversations with them, it was clear to me that we all thought a lot about our family's histories. We also had a lot of different memories. Some people thought my grandpa served in the Chinese army. Some people didn't know. Some people knew he served in the Southern Vietnamese forces, but everyone had some kind of colorful image in their head. I would ask what they remembered, and there is an almost Hollywood scene that they can describe to detail. We just never talked about it to each other. We also all felt a little bit guilty for not really knowing and not knowing how to ask. So my Royce project actually came to me as I was brushing my teeth with my brother at home a month or so after I had interviewed my cousins. Suddenly I thought to myself, what if it was normal to talk about these things with each other as we're brushing our teeth? What if it was normal, especially in the formative years of identity building, high school, I thought, because my brother was in high school at the time. What if people shared then what they thought they knew of their family histories? What kind of story could we create then? And how would we feel about them? So there began my Royce project. That summer, through the Royce Fellowship, I ended up leading a workshop composed of 12 Vietnamese American high school or just recently graduated high school students. and I titled it the Vietnamese American Storytelling Workshop. We read through T. Bui's The Best We Could Do, using it as a rubric to discuss memory and history, family, war, identity. We met outside of our local library on picnic blankets, and it was really special to me because this is the library I also grew up reading things in and exploring around. There were two main aims to this workshop. The first one was really just to initiate a capacity building project. I was really bothered by a lot of the classwork that I did and how it just was retained to one class or one paper that culminated at the very end of the semester that only me or my professor would ever see. I wanted to see something instead that would last beyond a simple summer, beyond a simple semester, that would last in my brain as well as the minds and the hearts of the participants in the workshop. And so capacity building really means is that this workshop wasn't a one and done thing, but rather a building of community. I really wanted to help connect our group, not only to each other, but also to our parents and our grandparents whose stories we were exploring. Also our friends and our Vietnamese American community. This workshop really happened as the world was opening up again. And this meant that I was located in my hometown, which is Orange County, California. Not until college did I learn that my hometown, Orange County, California, houses the densest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam itself. I did not really ever ask myself why or how I was a part of that history. So now I wanted our group to reckon with that fact, to see ourselves as part of that history, and to give back to it as well. The second goal I had in this workshop was to deconstruct a learning model. And in doing so, to deconstruct the normative ways we learn about history. This meant treating silence with the same respect and comfort as robust discussion. I also created what I called a collaborative working syllabus, where anyone can comment and add to the document. I didn't want to call myself a teacher or an instructor because really I was only 3 or 4 years older than the participants. I saw myself more as a facilitator, especially because I reckoned with memory in the same ways that these participants did. So I modeled the structure after Tama Okun's article that breaks down white supremacy culture, trying my best to intentionally prioritize a culture of appreciation over perfectionism, quality over quantity, experience over documented production. And that was really, really hard, but also really, really worth it. And it created a community in which we actually wanted to be there and we wanted to see each other. I mean, the people who signed up for this workshop were students who had just finished a heavy year of online learning, and yet they wanted to come together twice a week and discuss these really difficult topics. And Jesus, if you could share the Google slides really quickly. I wanted to share pictures that we took together. So the very first one on the very first slide, which is right before this one, if you could click that is sort of the structure in which we sat together. So sometimes we had to relocate because the cars were very loud, but everyone brought their own picnic blanket. Some people didn't bring picnic blankets, so I brought extra. And we would sit around in this circle outside of the library with no one really around except for ducks or maybe passing strangers. And we would open these books and we would read some passages aloud. We would think about them and we would share our own stories, the ways that we related to the text, which is really a text that's written by someone who was trying to explore her own family's histories. And the next picture is just at the very end of the workshop, in which we decided that we would take sort of fun family photos together almost. And so we were trying to create a heart because we wanted to reflect in a picture how we felt about the workshop, which was with much love. And a lot of these students actually are students of the high school that I went to. So it was really meaningful to me. A lot of them were freshmen when I was a senior at that high school, and coming back as a Brown student and seeing the growth that we all individually had now accumulating together in a little workshop that we had was really, really, really great. So there is, I think, a couple more pictures just to show. After the summer, what we did was we went out together actually to, it's called Phuc Luk Tha, which is translated Asian Garden Mall. And every summer, and this was the summer after COVID too, they have a night market. And so all of us went together to this night market and we just got to enjoy together. I think for the first time for me, it was a really intentional reckoning with culture, not just there to enjoy and have food, but after an entire summer of asking, what does it mean to be Vietnamese American? What does it mean that we're living in this place? And to be able to go and experience the celebratory nature of our culture that happens every summer and is often just taken for granted. And then the final picture here is at the very, very, very end. What we did was we had a celebration presentation. So really what this was each participant got a chance to share what they learned from the workshop, whether it's something they learned, something that was meaningful, they could read a passage, really they could do anything that they wanted. And we invited family and friends. So really whatever the participants wanted, they got to do, and they got to do it with the people who ultimately were the ones who inspired them to be a part of this workshop in the first place, which was really just family. So it was a lot of families coming together, bringing a potluck item, the same picnic blankets, and finally the adults now getting to see, wow, this is what my child or my grandchild has been doing all summer. And I think the most lovely part was they didn't even realize how much they had meant to their children and grandchildren, for their children and grandchildren to be exploring their histories. And so it was a very touching moment in which even the adults got to share what this experience meant to them. And so finally, I'd like to read a poem that one of the workshop participants, Jeannie Nguyen, wrote as part of one of our exercises and as part of a website that we are still working on. But I would just like to end with this poem. I am from dusty bookshelves, from half-filled notebooks and unwashed dishes. I am from the silence of weary parents after a long day at work, and bowls of fresh-cut fruit to make up for the absent I love yous. I am from the rose bushes and birds of paradise whose long-gone limbs I remember as if they were my own. I'm from family gatherings every Saturday and loud karaoke from my Benoy and Omnoy. I'm from thinning red envelopes and distant cousins whose names I can't recall. From yearly calls to Vietnam to family members whose faces are a haze in my memory. And running barefoot on the tiles at 8, chasing my brother who no longer glances my way. From sleepless nights and growing pains, from years of piano gone down the drain and fingers that have forgotten how to play a tune. I'm from steaming bowls of pho made by calloused hands, wrinkled with time, from strange herbs and liquids meant to soothe my sickness, but only succeeded in making me feel worse. I'm from a household where my roots have never been forgotten, and no matter how far my feet wander, I will always know the way back home. And I wanted to end especially thanking the Royce Fellowship and especially Jesus and Maggie, who have dealt with my late emails, and Professor Mary Kim Arnold and Erin, who is in this room today. Thank you so much for helping me and calling me and soothing my worries, but especially to Thomas, Ryan, Jessica, Emily, Toby, Jeannie, Kang, Vincent, Anthony, Jenny, Wendy, and Amy. Thank you. Oh, You can also reach me at my email, Kaitlan_Bui, if you would like to talk about really anything. I'd love to chat. And I forgot, a horrible thing to forget, but I am introducing Rita with her wonderful presentation on queering Morocco.
I'd like to introduce Danielle Emerson, who's going to be presenting a project on uplifting Native and Indigenous perspectives in children's literature ELA classrooms.
Hello. I'm going to attempt to share. Let's see. We going? Oh, wait, no, wait. Oh, okay. Sweet. We good? We there? It's here? Nice. So I guess to start, Danielle Emerson class in Michelin, Tanzania, Bashishchi, Tachini, Dashanella. Hello, Natalia is Shagande Michelin and Kotego Edine Edzon Michelin. Yeah, Danielle. I am the Red Tree clan, born from the Tango clan. My great-grandfather was the Salt clan, and my paternal grandfather was the Red Running in the Water into the Water People clan, and I'm from Shiprock, New Mexico, and I am Dene. So I guess for this project, I mostly curated a valuable list, like a list of valuable children's in YA, and later extended into fiction and memoir literature that centers like Native and Indigenous perspectives and representations. So I work in collection of comprehensive like ELA plans that can be included for like contemporary and Native Indigenous literature for both middle school and high school classrooms. So like, I guess in my experience, mostly many Native and Indigenous books and poems are very much inaccessible to Native Indigenous students within their own classrooms, especially on their own land, which is very just weird to think about. And I stated before, I'm from Shiprock, New Mexico, and my schools had little to no Native and Indigenous like books written by those types of authors, aside from Sherman Alexie, who is very problematic for a lot of reasons that we won't really get into in this presentation, fortunately. And so as a Dene student, I would have loved having access to like these types of knowledges and these books and these stories and perspectives, especially if they were introduced into the curriculum and like unit as possibly as a replacement for books that have always been in the curriculum, like, you know, Shakespeare and all those great Western literatures. And so to like guide my research, I guess, these are just some of the overarching questions I asked. So like what aspects of ELA curriculum can be changed to include more like diverse voices? How can schools improve the ELA curriculum by incorporating Native Indigenous children's YA literature? And how can representative books and literature in the curriculum uplift students in both their understanding of self and sense of value? So yeah, Ruth Sims Bishop describes children's literature as like mirrors, windows, or sliding glass doors. Mirrors because books can reflect our own experiences back at us, and like this concept in literature is important when considering, I guess, the limited number of mirrors for children of color, especially for Indigenous and Native students in education. And many researchers have recognized this negative impact of like representation on Indigenous youth. And they're very much advocating for reconciliation in children's literature. And so Braybor and McCarthy, who I also quoted, have written multiple articles on the incorporation of like Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum that also works as like a broader form of social justice pedagogy. So they say a culturally responsive curriculum reinforces Indigenous knowledges, bringing to schools, drawing on substantial elements that knowledge while tapping local languages and oral traditions to plummet deeper meaning. So it's very much, I guess, like these knowledges and these stories and these perspectives should be reflected back to students at early ages, and also just like throughout their life. And school is such a huge, it's just such a huge impact on students, especially because we spend like hours there. So it just makes sense to have these mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors readily available to them. There we go. And this quote, I guess, is a snippet from an interview with Esther Billin, who is a Dene writer and multimedia maker from Los Angeles. So I pulled this from an interview where it focused on Billin's first book of poetry. It's called From the Belly of My Beauty. And throughout this interview, we're told that writing for Billin is activism and activism is writing. And I felt that her response to like the question that the interviewer asked really resonated with my goals of this project. So the interviewer asks, how can you make young people interested in reclaiming their language and their culture? How can you make young people interested in poetry? What strategies do you employ in the classroom? And Billin replies, I believe they're already interested. It is the way poetry is taught that makes them lose interest. The power beneath the words and histories, that is what makes it so amusing. And young people love the show aspect, slams. They have it all inside them. It is just as simple as laughter. With my writing students, I like to do physical interactive movements, goofy things like blocks. I use media in my own poetry to build up a discussion, sometimes music. And just really quickly, I guess kind of wanted to go into like the background research that sort of guided my questions. So this is an article about, I guess, like Indigenous knowledge and young Indigenous children's literacy learning. So I guess the main takeaway from this article is that like oral language development and comprehension listening skills are like, they're all different basically, and different forms of narrative and story structure that is, I guess, that is very prominent in Indigenous like ways of knowing, aren't incorporated at all into the education system. And of course that very much like disrupts, I guess, their way of understanding things, which just sort of leads to this cycle of like low grades or lack of achievement or being painted as problem child. And I guess the knowledge, like their knowledge as children and their knowledge from their families and their culture need to be respected in order to like bring up their literacy basically. And similarly, this is another paper. This one's very much centered on Dene youth and how three Dene teachers from different parts of the Navajo Nation incorporated like cultural revitalizing pedagogies. So this included like speaking to some of their students in Navajo, or including, I guess, short stories or poems by Navajo writers and authors. So I guess the main takeaway from this is they interviewed most Navajo students and asked them sort of like what they thought the curriculum was missing and what they really enjoyed about having these Indigenous knowledges included in their curriculum. And I guess one quote from an interview is, so when Navajo is spoken in the classroom is not only a general indicator of culture and space. So it's kind of goes, well, this is reflected on the interview, I guess. And so words in the Navajo identify relationship to with the world. It is this world, the Navajo world that Irma Benali brings into the classroom. She brings it because she embodies it. The students accept it by learning to speak the language so as to embody it as well. And I guess this kind of just gets back into my process. So first, I sort of started by looking online, like for Native Indigenous authors and book recommendations. There are so many, authors on Twitter and Instagram who are 100% willing to talk about their books, to promote them. Especially there are so many who are Native Indigenous who are on Twitter and are looking to like get word out there. And of course, there's weneeddiversebooks.org. That movement has transformed the amount of like acknowledgement otherwise overlooked communities receive. They uplift authors and readers of color, and it's just a very great resource for anyone interested in looking into books that go against Western, I guess, conventional narratives. And of course, there's Dr. Debbie Reese's online list, and she's Namboy Pueblo, and she is currently curating her own list of like books by Native and Indigenous authors that she recommends to schools, to families. And I also looked into Navajo Nation language resources. So books that like educators from the Navajo Nation might recommend to homes to help with language preservation. So the Nepazan. And I took all these resources and sort of organized titles into an Excel sheet just so it wouldn't get lost, like all this stuff wouldn't get lost anywhere. And I included like summaries, some of the general themes of like the books or the articles or the papers, the general age group that I saw this fitting into, and the author information that included like the nation or the tribe that they're from, if the author had a website, and sort of like a brief review of like how I could see this fitting into a lesson plan and how I could see this sort of like being maybe paired with another, like a larger book that is a bit longer than say like an essay. And I did this for basically every book that I read and every like poetry and short story anthology that I came across, which yeah. And from that whole list, I sort of like looked into some of the poems and prose and books and tried to develop like a lesson plan based on like content. And I focused on New Mexico ELA standards just because that's where I'm from. And those are the communities that I want to reach out to first as I sort of continue to develop this project. And I also focused a lot on the incorporation of house-made homework, which was a term made by Hoover and Dempsey. So like, I guess to describe this, it incorporates the students' and families' background, like their knowledges and cultures, so that the homework and activities that they're expected to take home or expected to do in the classroom aren't like isolating and unresponsive to the child's identity. And this is just sort of some of the books that I've looked into. The genre is the children's lit, young lit, fiction and prose, poetry, creative nonfiction, memoir. Yeah, Danielle Geller from Memoir. Tiffany Midge, Lucy Ponzo, Tommy Orange, Rebecca Roanhorse. And I generally tried to focus on literature recommended to readers between the ages of 10 and 18 years old, since I wanted to, I guess, yeah, create lesson plans for those either in the middle or high school. And again, just some visual like representation of like the books I've looked into. So children's middle grade, young adult literature, Rebecca Roanhorse, Brian Young, all these people. And some of the fiction, prose, and poetry and memoir. And I guess kind of getting into, I wanted to share some of like the examples of the lesson plans I did. So each lesson plan is roughly 1 hour to 45 minutes long, based on like themes of like home, culture, language, identity, and includes like either ELA vocabulary or literary devices, such as like, you know, similes, metaphors. And I did my best to like curate a list of open-ended response questions and take-home activities based on like grades and elements that fell into like elementary, middle school, and high school. So I tried my best to like edit it to make it shorter, so it's not too much text on the screen. But this was the first one. This is based on the poem that came from and a poetry anthology. Where the light. It's a long title, but in that anthology, there's a bunch of short poems written by Indigenous and Native authors. The first poem I chose was Bury Me with a Band by Orphelia Zepeda. She is a Tohono O'odham poet, author, and academic from Stanfield, Arizona, and she specializes in Indigenous language and linguistics. So I guess like I'll read the poem and then just give a little, I guess, sort of summary of like the activity I was thinking of doing with this. So bury me with a band. My mother used to say, bury me with a band. And I'd say, I don't think the grave will be big enough. Instead, we buried her with creosote bushes and a few worldly belongings. The creosote is for brushing her footprints away as she leaves. It is for leaving the earth away as from her sacred remains. It is for leaving the smell of the desert with her, to remind her of home one last time. And so like the general goal of each lesson plan is usually listed at the top. So I thought like write a poem based on or using dialogue. So including like conversations or quotes, and focus on building or conveying like characterization through voice. There's a general intro activity to get students to think about like what voices are and like what type of voices does your best friend have, your teacher, your parents, your grandparents, even your pets, and like having students sort of write down descriptive words about a specific person's or animal's voice for a little while. And then reading the poem, telling them to look for like examples of characterization, or like how is this person being described, or what is this person saying specifically. And then just like a discussion of the poem. So like, what is this poem about? How does the writer feel about the person this poem is like writing about? How does this poem make you feel? And then sharing examples. And then like the general prompt at the end is sort of like to tell students to like look back at their descriptive words from the intro activity and write like a poem based on their chosen person's characterization. So it's like include like similes, metaphors, direct quotes and phrases. And so yeah, that's one of the short like summarized versions of a lesson plan for this little poem here. And this is just another one. I won't this is by Gladys Cardiff. Yeah, combing. This one sort of like focuses a lot more on like using, I guess, simile and metaphor for like the favorite memory, and ask students to think about their favorite memory for like 5 to 10 minutes. Students would share 3 words and describe for their memory. Write down 3 of their favorite words, and then the reading of the poem. And then just sort of again asking students to describe what's happening in the poem. What is the narrator remembering? What is she sharing with the reader? Is it a happy memory? What words would you use to describe this memory? And sort of like have them reflect on that for a moment. And then each lesson sort of like ends with the writing prompt. So like asking students to return to the list of words from the intro activity and using what was shared from the poem as like a reference of what they've sort of just learned, and writing a poem on memory with at least one metaphor. And I really like this poem actually, just because it talks about like themes of family and like a lot with, I guess, a mother and a daughter, and hair is a huge thing in our culture. So I just want to read it before we move on. So bending, I bow my head and I lay my hands upon her hair, combing and think how women do this for each other. My daughter's hair curls against the comb, wet and fragrant, orange parent. Her face downcast is quiet for one so young. I take her place. Beneath my mother's hands, I feel the braids drawn up tight as piano wires and singing vinegar rinsed. Sitting over the oven, I hear the orange coils tick the early hour before school. She combed her mother Matilda's hair using a comb made out of bone. Matilda rocked her old wooden chair, her face downcast, intent on tearing rags into strips to braid a cotton rug from bits of orange and brown. A simple act, preparing hair, something women do for each other, plating the generations. And then Dog Flowers by Danielle Geller is a memoir, so it's an entire book. And Danielle Geller is from the Navajo Nation, and she's a MFA graduate from University of Arizona for creative nonfiction. And I think personally, if I would have read this in high school, I feel like I would have felt so much better about existing in classrooms, and just like would have felt more seen as a student. So I just sort of shared like 3 examples of like some of the discussion questions I would have asked students. And on the side is like a quote that felt resonated with me personally, and I feel really draws on the themes of like family and grief and healing that this memoir sort of gets into. So I'll read that. Some days I think I should not have meddled with my mother's things. No bundle of sage could protect me. I am ghost sick, possessed by every wrong thing she was unable to bring into balance in her life. Some days I believe I should have buried her suitcase in Dale's garden, lost these histories forever in Florida's black earth. Most days I do not believe I know how to care for my mother's ghost. So I guess like the first discussion question sort of asks like, how does image and photography become like a language, like a narration? Because the memoir relies a lot on Danielle Geller going through her mother's own images and sort of like including them into her narration and like her stories that she shares with her families. And it just asks them to like choose a family photograph or perhaps a collection of photographs and use them to explore your own voice in narration. And the other one is all throughout the novel, Geller utilizes a personal archive for mother's belongings. And the question I wanted to ask like students is like, what exactly is an archive and how does it add to the memoir's overarching themes of like care, healing, and loss and absence? And the third one sort of asks like, Geller included entries from her mother's diaries. And as we read, we realize these entries aren't long and are only a few sentences at most. So I want to like start asking students to pay special attention to where another voice speaks, such as maybe her sister Eileen, Laureen Lee, which is Geller's mother and Geller's father. What are these exchanges like and how do they differ from each other from Geller's own narration? Again, to get students like sort of to like look more into the specifics of how characterization is sort of created through how we present people or how people are read. So those three, I guess, are sort of my little examples of like the type of in-depth like reading and sort of exploring that I'm doing with all of these books.
Danielle, you have about like 1 minute to wrap up.
Yeah. And just like additional resources like Red Planet comic books, if you ever want to look into like more of these things, Birch Bark books, Native Voices books on Twitter, Debbie Reese again, Abalone Mountain Press, also on Twitter. The Midnight Librarian is Indigenous booktuber on YouTube. And again, Nilsen Yazi, an Indigenous book reviewer on Twitter. All of these were great resources that I definitely recommend to like educators or anyone who is interested. People who I want to reach out to, schools on the Navajo Nation. I do want to expand this a bit more, but this is very much what I guess my home is very much what I want to focus on right now in my community. And just like future development, so like partner with educators back home, continuing to build my list with more in-depth reviews and like explore different types of lesson plans and like unconventional resources, so like maybe TikToks or like comics, and then like expanding access, so like how would I share these resources as a rather than just like emailing them. So like, should I create something online, make a Twitter account? And then just of course talking more with Native Indigenous students, so like inviting student voice feedback, similar to like partnering to like educators back home. And yeah, thank you. That's my presentation. And yeah, there's a bunch of people who helped me get here. So thank you to all of them. And next, how do I exit? Whoop, stop share. Oh no. Stop share. There's a big red button in the top that I just could not see. So next I would like to welcome Ben Connor with Translating the Refugee Experience.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm going to attempt to share, although it seems like we're having terrible luck with that today. So here goes. Okay. Oop. How are we doing? Can we see something? Jesus, you're giving me a weird face. What does that mean?
It says that you started screen sharing, but I see a black screen. Are you showing a black screen?
No, I can see what I've got. Wow, we're really going through it today.
There it is. There it is.
Yay? Okay, great. Great. Well, my name's Ben. My project is called Translating the Refugee Experience. So in 2020, I met a unique group of people who lived across the world from me. They and I all shared something. We were all translators. And I met these fellow translators through an organization called Natakalam, which is Arabic for we speak. That's an organization that seeks out refugees and displaced persons who are bilingual, as many refugees are, and connects them to opportunities in freelance translation and language teaching. I was an intern at Natakalam. I was doing marketing and lead generation. And in getting to know some of the translators who worked there, I was really struck by the unique perspective they had on translation. I do translation in a fairly sheltered academic context. I translate academic articles and literature sometimes. But I was meeting people for whom translation was not only a lived experience, but a source of income and also a sort of vessel for some of the journeys that they had undergone as displaced people. And it got me thinking about the interplay of those two things. Just a disclaimer before I sort of dive into the research question and the project, and that is that I won't be using any specific names today of the people I worked with. I won't be telling really individual stories in detail. This is because the displaced people that I worked with over the summer are in a variety of situations across the world. Some are living in places that we would think of as stable, some are not. Some would be super proud to have their name, emblazoned under their work on display. Some would not. And so I never wanted to put people in the position of needing to tell me that they'd rather be anonymous. So that was something I told them at the outset, is that I would not be using names. Just, if you're curious why you won't hear any. Great. So the question I was looking to examine at the outset is this one. How can the perspective of a refugee translator influence the ways in which the poetry of displaced persons is translated, especially into English? And that's a question that might be met with a sort of, why do we need to know this? What are the stakes here? Why does it matter? How can the perspective of a refugee translator influence the ways in which poetry is translated? Why does that make a difference? And it's something that I grappled with as I was applying to the Royce and beginning the Royce is, why does this have any weight, this conclusion? And it's not something that I really found a viable answer to until I began looking at secondary source literature once the Royce was well underway. And so, in just a few sentences, the UN Human Rights Commission estimates that in recent years, the global displaced persons crisis has ballooned to somewhere between 78 and 82 million people, including 26 million who fall very squarely under the legal definition of refugees. Leaving one's home country, sometimes under rushed or violent circumstances, often goes hand in hand with extreme fear, with loss of livelihood, with trauma. And as mental health communities in the nations that harbor large migrant populations, so sometimes that's Western Europe and the United States, for example, have devoted more resources to examining the effects of the stress that migration can cause, creative writing has begun to be seen as a viable outlet for traumatic stories, for feelings of displacement, and for a variety of other emotions. What came across my desk, as it were, as an impetus for this project were a couple of collections of books written or co-written by refugees that appeared on the market, and many used poetry to work through post-migration stress. And a couple of those were moving poetry collections from Syrian refugees, either written or co-written. And they were personal narratives. They were in memoir poetic form about personal lived experiences. Generating one's own poems and stories, I think, can be a tall order for those who are not in a position, emotional or political or financial, to devote resources to taking the time and energy to put on paper one's own experiences. That can be a weighty task. So my project aims to explore the alternative that translation provides as a creative outlet. Translations of the poetry of displaced persons by refugees place into conversation the form, the content, the author, and the translator, all of which have crossed some kind of border, linguistic, cultural, or otherwise. And so here's a quote from Paul Ricoeur, who's a translation theorist. And he says, translating means welcoming another language into one's own. It also means to exile oneself, to inhabit the place of the other in order to understand him. And that's sort of what sparked the impetus of this project. In meeting and learning from refugee translators in the course of my work at Nantacolum, I was really struck by the parallels between, the sort of form of their lived experience and crossing borders, also matched up with the form of their work, which is a linguistic border crossing of sorts. And so this research aimed to examine the effect the lens of the refugee experience has on the art of translation, and in equal measure, what effect the latter has on the former. So logistics-wise, I reached out to a team of about 15 refugee translators who worked with Nantacolum, and some of the languages that they translated from, or that they worked in, including English, were Arabic, Kurdish, French, Spanish, Swedish, Persian, Greek, Turkish, Lingala, and Farsi. So we had a very eclectic mix. And it's worth mentioning that the only one of those languages that I speak is French, meaning the vast majority of what these folks translated from into English were original poems that I couldn't read and couldn't understand. And so it was a sort of a gesture of blind faith to say, translate this for this project, but I will never be able to read the originals, which is a really interesting dynamic. And it allowed for some productive conversations so that they could explain some cultural context of what they were translating to me, because I couldn't read the originals. So I asked them to choose short literary works in their non-English language or non-English languages, whatever those languages may be. And in most cases, those short literary works were poems. A couple of songs made it in there. And I asked them to translate those into English. That was supplemented by some virtual conversations. These folks live all over the world, so this was all over Zoom, that I had with each translator when I asked basically why they had chosen the work they had chosen, what was significant about that, and what it meant to them to translate that piece, what that experience was like. A big motivation for doing this through the Royce was to be able to properly compensate these translators for the time and energy that they put into doing this, because artistic catharsis is all well and good, but it feels a little bit like an empty gesture if it's not backed up financially. And these folks are, in many cases, professional translators. They're in a variety of situations, but they ought to be paid what they're worth, in essence. So I just want to return to this question as a grounding point. This is what we were hoping to look at as we embarked on this project of asking these folks to translate and then talk about what that translating meant to them. So this is the part where I stop talking. I don't really stop talking. I'm going to keep talking, but it's not going to be my words anymore. I want to share with you some of the selections of what the translators produced. This is sort of the meat of the project. This was what got produced. And again, I have permission to reproduce these translations and some quotes from the translators about why XYZ was particularly impactful or why they chose XYZ piece of poetry, but you're not going to see particular names. So this is a poem called Faces of Portugal, which, despite the name, was written in French originally and was translated by one of the translators I worked with, who has ended up living in Europe. I have walked through these regions where these great discoverers of the world were born. Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama. I saw sordid slums. I saw shallows of Lisbon. I followed the immigration road. I saw illegal smugglers, Portia, climbing up Javi's paths, talking with little shepherds dressed in a coat made of leaves. Taste aurora in Pyrenees, taste of winter, of weeping and of anguish. I had to wait on a long queue in the station of Hendage. Here, behind each of these faces, there is Portugal, its half-century of darkness, misery, and depression. And for a little context, the poet who wrote this originally was named Gerald Blancourt, and he was a photojournalist, and a lot of his work involved documenting the struggle of Portuguese immigrants to France. There's a big influx of Portuguese immigrants to France in the 50s and 60s, and he not only documented through photos, but also through poetry, the difficulties of their experience. And that's something that resonated with the translator who ended up choosing this to translate into English. And she wrote, I remember when I went for my interview, and she's talking about an interview with basically the equivalent of customs to prove a well-founded fear of returning to her home country. I remember when I went for my interview and I met the interviewer who made me feel so uncomfortable throughout the whole process. And she kept saying, I don't believe you. And it was a very awful experience. I remember entering the train and not feeling comfortable with the things people were saying about me, not knowing I was hearing everything they were saying. I also remember how uncomfortable it was to live and share a small room with another lady from Malawi, as we shared different cultures and values. As such, we lived in two different worlds, which was very hard when living in direct provision. So I chose these particular excerpts because something within each of them proved sort of representative of the whole. So I tried to choose things that had trends I was seeing throughout in all of the interviews and translations that were compiled. And something from this that came up is the feeling that people around you maybe don't expect you to speak the language as well as you do. That's something that came up in quite a few of the little testimonial, interview, Zoom conversations that I had, is that people moved to new countries and they encountered people who were surprised that they spoke the language. And that's something that's true here. And what was interesting is that the folks I worked with tended to connect translation with, having the agency to be able to show, oh, look, I speak these two languages well enough to create a bridge between them. And so it's a sort of act of power and assertion of competence in two languages and the ability to connect them that sort of proves agency there, which is something I had never thought about. Another thing, as we move to the next one, that I wanted to make sure I did was make sure that I wasn't just asking these folks to translate poetry that was about refugee experiences and the experience of displaced persons, because it seemed pretty reductive to say, you are this one thing, so just find poems about this one thing. So, I left the gates kind of wide open for them to translate poetry about whatever they wanted, and got some selections that I'll share with you here that are about things that have nothing to do with crossing national borders. So here's one from a Syrian poet called Nizar Kabani. Should I fall dead, you wouldn't even know it, although you're the one who broke me. It's not your fault, though, for neither do I show it, nor do you know. My tongue and heart keep it a secret, yet my tears spill it all. My tears might not be enough to tell you how much love I hold for you, but my gauntness says it all. And another from Nizar Kabani. Love is not some oriental romance at the end of which lovers wed. It is sailing without a ship, knowing that is in vain. Love is hands that can't stop trembling, and that silent question sealed upon the lips. So the translators who chose these Kabani poems were motivated by different things. He's a very popular poet, but something that struck me in particular was how universal the experiences shared in these poems are, and how much more universal they become once we can read them in our own languages. And so from one of the translators who translated these Kabani poems, he said, unrequited love is something I've struggled to avoid again and again throughout my life because of poetry like this, as it helps me realize how weak and vulnerable one-sided love can lead one to be, and makes me strive to protect myself from being dragged into emotional turmoil, which, relatable. Anyway, the third selection I want to share with you is from a Swedish poet named, I'm going to mispronounce this, Anna Planting Gillenbaga. That's a guess at the pronunciation. It's called White Little Sock. Like a white little sock in a pile of red clothes, I feel odd and sometimes rejected, risk being stained to completely change just to be like them. But I want the red ones to see that I am white, that they should see and feel that I belong here, because I look at the world in my own way, and no one should say it is wrong or right. And this thing is covering the top line of this, so I'm going to skip to the second line. If it is always to be governed by what is the norm, so let me be exactly who I am. It is not much, but that is all I ask for. This one I chose because the translator expressed something that was pretty representative of a lot of the interviews and testimonials that I went through, which is a feeling of being torn between two homelands, essentially. And I'm not going to read this entire paragraph because it's a long one, but the essence of it, essentially for this translator, and it was a lengthy discussion, was feeling guilt at being distanced from her original home, feeling guilt at knowing more about Swedish culture, that's the nation she ended up in, than her home culture, and feeling both Iranian and Swedish, but also neither. And then it taking a long time, years and years, to sort of come to grips with an identity that falls somewhere between those two places. And this also was sort of manifest in translation that requires you to sort of stretch out and bridge a gap between two different worlds. So I want to return to the question that started it all. How can the perspective of a refugee translator influence the ways in which the poetry of displaced persons is translated, especially into English? It's not a question with a pat answer, and it's not one with a quantifiable answer either. But it is something that I asked the folks that I worked with, and together we sort of compiled a couple thoughts, a couple suggestions for what the relationship of these two things is. So I want to share those thoughts with you now. One is that poetry can lose or gain something in translation. That's an acknowledgement of the fact that crossing borders is not a simple transference. I heard again and again from translators, oh, this isn't the same as the original. You're really not getting the essential X, Y, Z. And I heard within the content of the poems and within the content of the conversations that I had with translators that, you know, there's something not replicable about reading the literature of one's home culture when one has moved to a new place. So, you know, it's powerful to be able to translate this and acknowledge that something is lost. To even be able to speak that and to have that conversation is meaningful. Hopefully something is gained too, and that is sort of the question we're attacking here. Poems can be reminders of home, and that can be a good or a bad thing. And no one, least of all me, is claiming that translating poetry is an unalloyed good thing. But translating poems into the language of a country that one moves to can be a symbolic act of moving homelands. And this is something I heard from some of the translators I worked with, that there was some, you know, element of helpful analogy in being able to take something from one's home country and bring it into the culture where they live now. Poems can be an escape from reality, and translations can be a leap away from the language of the original. And so, in some cases, there were things from the pasts of the folks that I worked with that they wanted to leave behind. That could be connected to their language, that could be connected to the poems that they ended up translating. But we leave something behind when we translate, and that does imbue the translator with some agency in movement and being able to choose what stays, essentially, and what goes in translation. Finally, and this is a big Paul Ricoeur thing, the guy I quoted earlier on, translation is an act of hospitality. It can be empowering to welcome others into your own cultural tradition. And as I mentioned before, the vast majority of the languages involved in this project, I don't speak. That meant that there had to be a lot of conversations where it was explained to me what was going on, what cultural nuance was lost, what the cultural context was, who these poets were. Many of them, nearly all of them, I had not heard of. It can be empowering for folks to be able to welcome others into their cultural tradition, even for just a moment, especially when they're in the milieu of being constantly welcomed into someone else's cultural tradition. So it's nice to have that agency in being the translator and having the 2,000-foot view of both the source text and the target language. So those are just 4 thoughts without any real congealed final answer. Of course, there will never be one, but those are sort of 4 stabs at this question. And with that, I want to thank Chuck Royce for making this possible. I want to thank Jesus and Maggie for facilitating, and the whole Royce cohort. And especially, although I can't list all their names, the folks that I worked with on these translations. Obviously, without them, none of this would have been possible. And we had some really generative, meaningful discussions over the summer that I'm better for. So I'm going to stop sharing and throw it back to Maggie and Jesus.
Thanks, Ben. Now we're open for Q&A. You can either use the chat or just start speaking at will.
I have a question for Danielle, actually. I know that you also write creatively, and I wanted to ask how you incorporate these themes of like representation and like what you said about the words are escaping me, but basically sort of the theme of your project and your own sort of practice of writing itself.
Yeah, we write together for post actually, don't we? Yeah. I think, yeah, so a lot of like, I think a lot of my writing really revolves around like family, where I come from and place. And I think like that's always consistent. That's always like in like Indigenous and BIPOC students like heads, basically where they come from, who they are, like what makes up, I guess, their own like ways of knowing in this world. And I think I started as like someone who I started as a reader, and I guess writing personal narrative and fiction that sort of encompasses my own identity and like culture and background sort of led me to question why, I guess, books that were required to read in school don't do that. And I don't know, I guess it's just very much like they're not like it's very much not a separate thing. They're very much both connected and very much both part of who I am, and very much things that should exist and sadly don't sometimes within schools, especially on native land, which does not make any sense. But yeah, thank you.
I'm so interested in this kind of tension that you really articulated, Ben, of like working with people and you don't speak the language as you're trying to translate something. And I think that's an experience that kind of resonates in each of your projects in certain ways, whether those are memories that you maybe don't have access to, but like also feel connected to. Or I know, Rita, you were thinking a lot about your own positionality throughout this project. And I wondered if you could kind of speak to the ways that each of you have sort of bridged these experiences or language or knowledges that you don't necessarily have access to, but feel connected to in particular ways, and kind of how do you negotiate that?
I mean, I can say just briefly, I think I started out the summer feeling very insecure about that and wanting to make up for it by, delving into research about all of the poems, poets, languages that I knew nothing about. But what I found is that the folks that I worked with really enjoyed being able to explain some of this. And so there's value in starting out from a place of no knowledge, being able to sit with that, and then just learning something.
I can also try to answer that a bit, because I think, Ben, like some of the feelings you outline, I can also resonate with. Like actually, when I heard that I, was awarded the Royce Fellowship, I was thinking whether I should accept it or not. And I even had conversations with advisors and such, because I felt insecure and not necessarily legitimate to take on this project. Because like, yes, I'm part of communities that, I'm doing this project on and with, being queer, being Moroccan, being an activist, but also like I have a different class positionality than most of the people I was working with. I'm right now, in academia in the US and receiving funding from it. I've been in the US for like 4 years now or something. And I've been disconnected from communities in ways. I mean, online activism and organizing and stuff helps, but still language wise too, like some languages that are spoken in Morocco I don't speak, like Amazigh, like the groups of indigenous languages, and my Moroccan Arabic is not as good as some other people. So I was feeling all of these insecurities and feeling illegitimate to take on this project, and really like to the point that I was thinking like, should I do this project or not? But actually, like, for me, what helped was truly like making this a collaboration, and this is like as much my project that it is like everyone else's project that like worked on it, and also like acknowledging these positionalities like deeply and having conversations about them, and also leaning in and learning. And as I said, like oral history elements were both like the scariest and the best part of this project. It was scary because, you know, these people I admired, I read their works and stuff I was talking with, and I was like, oh, like what if I don't know this or that, etc. But at the same time, it was great because I learned so much, and it truly felt like a collaboration. But yeah, definitely I can resonate to some of that.
Yeah, I relate wholeheartedly to both comments that were made before, like of insecurity and also just like not knowing, and beginning in a place of I need to compensate my not knowing with knowing at least something else that's related possibly. And I think this is really just ingrained, you know, in us academically and at Brown. But I think one way that I have realized to sort of counteract this, one, it is really tiring because, as Rita said, you're like, okay, so what are my intentions? And then what are the intentions on top of the intentions? And like, am I asking these questions about my intentions correctly? Because I'm in a place of great like privilege, and I think just taking time instead of asking questions and then trying to answer them, to sit in silence. And for me, it has been like a practice of creativity as well. I really wanted to end on that poem that one of the participants in the workshop wrote, because I think this is the way out of this kind of, because I think it is really important to seek intention, but sometimes you can get so locked into this question of my methodology, is this right? What is just? What is, you know, correct? How will I not be criticized later if I write a paper on this and like 20 years later they're even more woke than the Royce Fellowship is right now, you know? No one can really like, no one can argue with what you have in the current moment though. And so I really, as I've been like looking at my thesis and the kind of methodology I've been wanting to use, I've come back time and again to this sort of praxis of poetry. So I really enjoyed your presentation, Ben, too. And it's just like poetry works with what it has, and it says things in words that words cannot say, which is so strange and interesting, right? But that's, I think, really what is at the heart of the translation experience. And translation meaning translating things that, you know, you can never really translate the whole experience. And I think that's within generations, not just language.
I'm wondering if each of you can give some advice for students who might be applying to the Royce Fellowship about the responsibility of research, because there's so many linkages here with like, Ben, you anonymized your translators. Rita, I also want to address the fact that we paused the recording for you, just in case anybody else is watching this, if they don't understand what happened. So maybe you can address that. And then Kaitlan and Danielle, you were also dealing with youth as populations. So maybe any advice that you can give to future fellows who might want to be engaging with vulnerable populations, or just might want to consider the responsibility of the researcher. Maybe Rita, you can start with talking why we paused the recording.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, if you're watching this later, you don't know what I'm talking about. And that's because, as I said in my presentation, really like security and safety was at the heart of the project since the very beginning. Because as I said, like these are very real consequences. Like a lot of the people I was working with, interviewing, were in exile in Europe today. forced exile because of the works they had done, you know, that is being archived, etc. And that was something we were hyper aware of because, you know, we were all impacted in different levels about that. And I think like if I were to give advice is to really like think about ethics thoroughly, but also really think about it in the context of the research you're doing. Because like really like how ethics translate in the project you're working on really depends on who you're working with, what are the dangers, what are the ethical considerations and such. And for me, some things that helped were a few different things. First, reading on stuff. There's a lot of really cool articles, research that's been done about really like thoughtful research. And yeah, like reading some of that about like ethics in research in general, but also like more specifically like with the kind of research you're doing. Like literally, I mentioned the 20 pages article. I think 7 or 8 of these pages are about ethics and ethical considerations and why and what and how. Another thing is going back to the advisor and the mentor. So I was also in conversation with my mentor, Professor Laoui, about that, about especially like in interviews, like how to implement safety, security, and ethics in general. So like having these conversations with advisors, with Jesus, Maggie, other people in the cohort, like really like talking about that can help figure out. And also again, collaboration, like we're also constantly in conversation with the different people in the project about, you know, what their needs are, what the worries are, what are people's different experiences. And it was actually like so much of a worry that we all participated, like people who were part of the project, to a cybersecurity training with like activists that were based in Kuwait, I think, to really think about like Google Docs is not necessarily safe, for example, Gmail isn't, Dropbox is, so yeah, like, but really, yeah, thinking about ethics in general and then the specifics of the situation you're working in and what are the needs and things to consider within that.
I think another thing I would add is I'm not sure for the rest of you, but the Royce was really my first time being able to like actually conduct research that really mattered to me. And that's like in my head, just like what research is. Otherwise, it was just, you know, looking up articles on JSTOR or something else. Like it was really my just first experience with research, period. And that was really weird at first because I didn't even know what that meant, truly. And being able to go into it knowing that it's going to change, but also that the process is probably going to be a lot longer. And so that means it's okay that it's not finished. I think, Rita, you said that the archive it's just beginning, actually. And I think for me too, I'm realizing, this is not going to stop here. And I think that's kind of what one should aim for, even because that means it matters, so that you're not just going to stop, you know, after summer because check mark, you've done your Royce presentation, but something that will last. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that because then you don't have to get everything right the first time. And it's totally fine to like leave it open. Erin knows this because I talked to her a lot about this during the summer, but there was always this tension for me about being able to record the moment, because it was so beautiful and robust. And like, I was like, I want to be able to remember this. And I know, especially as I'm dealing with memory, I know I'm not going to remember. But when you record or you're so obsessed with the idea of documentation, then you don't get the memory at all. And that is a tension also, I think, that especially researchers in the humanities and dealing with communities probably have to deal with, which is how much do I give to literally just this moment that I know if I don't record it or I take a picture, it's just going to dissolve like as every second ticks by. But there's also like goodness in that. So I know there's a lot of stuff that I haven't done and a lot of questions I'm like, should I have done that? But at the end of the day, you're doing the best that you can. And I think if anything, the way to not regret is just to do it with love. And I know that's super cheesy, but to do it with love and knowing that like you are trying. And that's the only way to not regret, I think.
Oh, yeah, so really, I guess, like care, care for backgrounds and perspectives, addressing things like voices with care, community and student educators with care, definitely avoiding deficit-based mindsets. Just like these are communities and youth, and they're not just missing something. There are various ways of knowing that vary between people and communities. And even though I'm the Net and part of the Navajo Nation, there are Navajos from Arizona, from New Mexico, from Utah, and they were all from like a similar, like we're from the same culture. We all have communities that work in different ways and values that sort of, I guess, are addressed in different ways. And this also applies to like Native and Indigenous people all around the world, all across North America. And it's not just something that you should approach thinking that they're missing something. So yeah, I guess it's just care and well-being at the heart of your work as you sort of go through your research.
Oh, okay. No, all I could add to that is like do be mindful before you at the outset, like what harm could this project do? Which is not a fun question that anyone wants to ask themselves. But to look at your project through rose-colored glasses is, I think, one, it's not going to do good things for your research, and two, it's sort of an irresponsible way to launch into something. So I would say ahead of time, start thinking about what are the less fun scenarios here, and how can we mitigate them at the outset.
Well, thank you all for the work that you've done and for sharing that work with us today, and for the conversation afterwards as well. We'll be back in the same Zoom room tomorrow for anybody who is watching this and wants to join us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.